Hi, Jing. Thanks for organizing this.
For being on time. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm visiting my parents, so I don't have a well-defined place to take this call from today.
Yeah, it can be challenging. But...
How are things? Are things back to normal at at Northwestern, Evanston with class? I mean, things offline mostly, or
no,
hybrid?
There's I guess Zoom, being introduced to Zoom was part of like a good thing because we can do things over longer distances now, but a good amount of things have been brought back to offline. So it's been pretty nice, especially with newer students and everything. So yeah, I can't complain.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, David. How are you?
Good, good. How are you?
Good. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you as well. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Aditya. Good to see you. Hi,
Hey,
everyone.
Pablo.
Adrian.
Good to see you too.
Hi,
Yeah.
Hi, Pablo. How are you?
Yeah. We're like a minute or so ahead, so I won't talk anymore. I'll let you take over, Adrian, in a sec.
Sure.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Jing, for agreeing to be like the guinea pigs first.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Oh, hi.
I'll wait a few more minutes.
Sorry,
Hi.
I'm not sure. I just received the link and I thought this is a good event. I hope I can still be a student. Can I? Hi, Adrian. How are you? Nice seeing you.
Good. How are you? Nice
Quite
to
a
see
while,
you.
eh? Time flies.
Yeah. It does. Okay. Maybe I'll give it like one more minute for people to potentially filter in, and then we can get started.
Yeah, I'll stop my video so that I can finish my lunch.
Sure. Enjoy your lunch. Okay. So I'll get started. I think we can get started now, and then if people filter in, that's fine as well. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time and joining us on the first session of our fall program for the Virtual Inter-University Symposium on Infrastructure Management. So today we'll be having some presentations from David Zani and Jing Yu. Each presentation should be about 20 minutes. And after that, we'll take 10 minutes for Q&A. So please, feel free to ask any questions. And people can speak their questions out or type them into the chat function, and I can read them out. And then I'll be sending out the link to the program website in case you haven't been registered on the distribution list. So you can feel free to click that link and register there. And with that, we can get started. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. David Zani is a PhD candidate at the Infrastructure Management Group at ETH Zurich. His work with Professor Brian Adey furthers prior research on the use of cost-benefit analyses. In 2021, David obtained his master's degree from ETH Zurich in spatial development and infrastructure systems. Before studying in Zurich, he attended the University of Texas at Austin, where he received his bachelor's degree in civil engineering in 2016. His prior experience has included various internships in engineering and risk consulting and construction contracting and management. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Adrian. And is it okay if I just share my screen? Is that?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Let's see if I can get this set up correctly. Can you see the presenter?
Great on our side. We see the full screen.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry, I'm at a seminar actually currently, so I'm trying to make the best of the hotel Wi-Fi and everything. I hope it all works out. Yeah, thanks again for having me. It's great to be here and talk. As you introduced me, my name is David. I'm at the ETH. It's the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. And just starting my PhD, actually, I was a research assistant for a year with the group, and now transitioning into the PhD. And so my research is still at a very early stage, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about what I'm doing, just give a flavor for what's going on, and then talk about some of our first findings in this regard, and then potentially how we will move forward and the next steps we will take. So the title I've given here is very broadly, do cost-benefit analyses lead to good projects? Our first insights. And before we get into any of the details, I'd like to start with a small story. The city is world famous. I assume most of you know this building, and it is this very building that has probably lent to this city's fame around the world. I know, at least for me as a non-Australian, Sydney has always been synonymous with Opera House. It might be because of a childhood movie when I was younger, Finding Nemo. Some of you might know it. There's a scene where Nemo and his companion they're trying to get to Sydney, and they ask a group of fish how to get there. And this is their response. So I don't know if the audio came through, but they ask where Sydney is, and the response is the Opera House. So for me, there's always been this link between Sydney and Opera House. It's the same thing. And if you think about it from a marketing standpoint, there's really not much more you can hope for as a city. It seems like this Opera House has done its job really well in marketing Sydney in the world, in pop culture. But I'll ask the question, do you actually know who designed the Opera House, who the architect was? And we aware that the architect secretly basically fled Sydney before the building was done, and that the building was almost abandoned several times. And that it was, when it was inaugurated in 1973, the architect wasn't mentioned at all and wasn't invited to the ceremony. Because in fact, from a cost standpoint, this in the political arena, this project was a complete disaster. The initial cost estimate was 7 million, which was increased to 102 million by its completion. So it's 1,400% cost overrun. In the words of Frank Gehry, talking about this building, he said that the architect persevered through extraordinarily malicious publicity and negative criticism to build a building that changed the image of an entire country. So there's kind of this duality of a very, very successful building that changed the image of an entire country, but at the same time, it's tied to this basically a political persecution of an architect. And in fact, the architect who won was 38 years old. And after they won, they weren't able to work for several years after this because of the fallout of this project. So there's kind of this two-sided coin going on. And a Sydney without the Opera House seems unimaginable now. And so if we ask the question, what was the cost and what was the benefit of this project? I mean, was it a success or was it a failure? Was it fair to essentially exile the architect for his work here, who was responsible for this disaster or for the success? And all these questions revolve around the concept of a cost-benefit analysis. It's just two estimates, a cost estimate and a benefit estimate. But this cost-benefit estimate can actually determine the fate of a project very early on. So it seems that it's in everyone's interest, both from the investment side and the user side, that these cost-benefit analyses be reliable. And it's this very power, I'll say, of the cost-benefit analysis that led us to the question, how good are we at making cost-benefit analysis? And specifically, how good are our estimates about costs and how good are our estimates about benefits? And if we're making decisions based on these estimates, how confident are we that we're actually making the right choices? And our research group is the infrastructure management research group. If you go to our website, you have a nice current picture of us. And if you look at the mission statement, we say we focus on the improvement of decision making from general planning for entire networks to detailed planning for specific projects. And at the core of decision making is oftentimes the cost benefit analysis. So what we're trying to look into is how good these estimates are. And if they're not good, are we making the wrong choices, or are we still making the right choices? Well, what is the link between these two things? And of course, I mean, the cost benefit analysis is not new. It's been around forever. It's used in all sorts of industries, not only the construction industry. And recently there's been a lot of development with machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data, trying to leverage these tools to improve our estimates and our project engineering. But the reality is that we're not getting much better at these analyses. There's still a lot of unfortunate failures and missteps that occur in the project management construction industry. So there seems to be something missing in this whole story. And this is kind of the starting point for my research going forward. And I'll quote Professor Bent Fluevberg here from the University of Oxford. I think he sums it up quite nicely when he says that when you combine the large cost overruns and benefit shortfalls with the fact that cost benefit analyses are typically at the core of planning and decision making, we see that such analyses can generally not be trusted. And the sentence kind of summarizes, for me at least, the state of the industry is that we see that cost overruns happen often. We see that benefits shortfalls happen often. And we see that the situation is not really improving. So it's been like this for a long time. And this research has been done in many different ways, have been published in many different ways in many different arenas, and the similar conclusions are usually met. And so as a research assistant this past year, I had the privilege of working with several different public utilities to analyze their project data. This includes water infrastructure, road and rail infrastructure, tunnels, bridges, and power plants as well. For example, one of our projects was the decommissioning of nuclear power plants and the construction of geological repositories in Switzerland. I mean, these are huge projects with huge multi-generational implications. And in fact, in this case, the people working on the nuclear decommissioning right now, they will not be alive when the project is over. So, I mean, the far-reaching implications mean that the decisions made today have a very critical effect on several generations in the future. The idea of cost benefit and decision making doesn't only apply to huge long-term project. It applies to any project where decisions are being made based on cost and benefits estimates. I mean, if you're maintaining a highway or you're trying to decide whether or not to build a new bicycle path, the decision comes down to an estimate of the benefits and of the costs. So by looking at all this data, we learned a lot about the unique context of different organizations, how each organization handles their cost benefit analysis. With these close collaborations, we were able to thoroughly analyze, also over time, through time as the projects progress, the project performances. And we could use these insights to maybe propose improvements to the methods that these companies are using. So this is the starting point, the base of our research, of our interest in this topic. And in the next 10 minutes, as I said, I'd like to just present 3 of our initial findings. So just kind of the entry into the research that we will be conducting. And as a first step in the cost benefit analysis, quite logically, is the cost estimate. These insights will be focused on the cost data that we have reviewed. So the first finding I've called the cone of uncertainty. And then this picture here is a very popular model for how estimate accuracy varies over a project's life. If you Google cone of uncertainty, you get about 13 million results. This picture here is from the AACE, the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering. And what it tells you here is that as a project progresses from a class 5 to a class 1, so increasing scope definition, that the band of uncertainty of the cost estimate narrows to a very narrow range at the end. And what these blue lines show is the 80% confidence interval of the cost estimate. But how sure are we really that this model is correct? I mean, does this model reflect the reality that project managers are faced with on a daily basis? And in our studies, and I guess you can probably sense what is coming, but in our studies, we've actually seen that this is not really the case. So this plot on the right here is now our own research showing the estimated costs as a ratio of final costs. So throughout the project, we have a first estimate and it moves through the phases until the final costs. And at the end, the ratio is 1 because the final costs as a ratio of final costs is just 1. And at the beginning, we see that the first estimate as a ratio of the final costs is actually pretty good. It's pretty close. The first estimate is very close to the final actual costs. But interestingly, we see that the estimates start to deviate more from the final costs as the project progresses. And then they come back down to they decrease in the end to the final actual cost. So there's kind of this weird thing going on where we begin with a very realistic estimate, close to 1, close to perfect, and then it deviates from the actual costs towards the later project phases. And if we think about this 80% interval here, which are again the blue lines, we see that the interval is not really at all a cone that narrows as the project goes on. It's more of like a beak or something. I'm still trying to find a good analogy here, but the point is that we don't see the theoretical behavior that we would expect. And for this was interesting for us, and so we talked to the project managers. We went through the planning guidelines of this specific company, and we found the following: that the first estimate in this company is subject to external approval. So there's an external body that green lights the project based on the first estimate. So if they like the number, they will give a go ahead for the project. And then the second estimate, that the general outline project, is subject to general or to external oversight. So again, the external body needs to approve any deviations from the agreed upon on scope. But then as we get to the detailed plan of the project, there's no more any external oversight. It's just the internal company making the changes and revisions and the change orders. And so we see there again that costs tend to increase. And so for us, this was very interesting. I mean, what does this mean? Why are we seeing this kind of evolution, and how does that impact project selection? What impact does this have on the decisions made in the early stages, in the first estimates of the projects? And is there even a negative effect on project selection or on budget efficiencies for programs? These are the kind of questions that come up when we see something like this. So this was the first finding, that this cone of uncertainty kind of doesn't really apply to some of these cases. Our second finding I've called unrealistic targets. This was data from another company that we looked at, where here on the left hand, we just have a symbolic monetary estimate. And what was happening in this company, they were making cost estimates, the project managers, 110, for example, and they had been comparing these initial estimates to a target cost. So you can imagine this being, for example, a dollars per square meter of building footprint. So kind of a benchmark. And these target costs were the basis for the yearly budget of the company, of their program of projects, their portfolio of projects. So when these target costs didn't match with the estimated costs, they just told the project managers to decrease the cost estimates somehow. And what was happening was that the new estimate of the project manager usually just had a flat rate decrease to fit within this box of the target. And again, you might see what's coming here, but what actually happened was that the final cost of the project went above the initial estimates to, on average, an 18% cost overrun. And this happened in a majority of the projects. So again, we see this kind of weird behavior where the actual early estimates are being influenced by, in this case, internal pressures. And the question that this brings to the table is, well, how do you improve your estimates or improve your decision-making if your own estimates are subject to internal pressures that may distort your actual project performance? So again, this is kind of a question that arises out of this finding about the unrealistic cost targets. Then the third and last insight that I want to show today, I've called a risk disconnect. What we see here on the y-axis is a project cost deviation. So a 0 is the case where the estimate aligns perfectly with the final project cost, and anything above 0 is the case where the estimate was lower than the final cost, so the project cost escalated. And on the y-axis, we essentially have the contingency, so how much money was set aside for risks, for uncertainties. And what we found here was that there was really no relation between these two, these axes. And so if you think about it, we see all kinds of combinations here. What we see is projects perceived as very risky or uncertain that had a high risk contingency because the project manager was not sure about a certain aspect of the project, but they actually underran their budget. So they ended up not being very risky projects. On the flip side, we see projects that had very low contingency, just a few percentage points, but that overran by 50% or more. And so there's no correlation between these two values. And what this shows us is that there's actually a disconnect between how risky we think the project is and how risky the project turns out to be. So we're not good at estimating risks. We're not good at understanding how uncertain our project is. And this then, of course, raises the questions, well, how good are we in general at understanding a project and how its cost outturn will be? So this is the third finding, talking about the disconnect between the risk behavior of a project. So this is where we are today at the beginning of my PhD. We've seen some of these things from our first analyses. We saw the cone of uncertainty being more like a beak, not really following that theory. We've seen the unrealistic target costs that apply internal pressures on costs. And we saw a disconnect between the perceived risk of a project and the actual risk of a project in the end. But why do these things matter? Why are these things interesting to us? Well, really simply, we want to make good decisions. As infrastructure managers, as investors in infrastructure, we want to make good decisions. And if we think back to the Sydney Opera House, if the real cost had been known at the beginning, would the opera have been built? And you could ask yourself, was it the right decision to build it, knowing what we know now? Or was the critique of the project justified? Was it successful? Was it a failure? And the important thing is that we need to have the data to confirm our decisions. We need to be able to look back and think about what the analysis showed us, what decision was made, and whether or not the decision was correct based on the analysis. But this is very difficult to do, especially in cases where the data is not around. So we need to find a way to use the data, and that entails finding a way to collect the data, finding a way to organize it, to analyze it, and then to use the data in a way that is efficient and pragmatic for project managers and for planners. So this is the general direction that I'm heading in, again, at the very beginning of my PhD, but this is kind of the diving board for what we hope to look into going into the next few years. And lastly, just in case you're interested and have not yet Googled it, the architect of the Sydney Opera was Jorn Utzon, a Danish gentleman. So with that, thanks a lot for your attention. I'd be very happy to answer any questions and or receive your feedback.
Thank you so much, David, for this really exciting presentation, not only on, so many of the fronts of what you presented in terms of references to projects that we might know about, but also on what's to come with your work. So this is exciting. So I guess we'll open the floor now for questions. If anybody has one, please unmute or put it in the chat. So Aditya, please.
Hey David, thank you for the presentation. I guess the first VISIM presentation. So, and wishing you all the very best on your journey ahead. So I guess a question that I just in terms of some of it was the visualization and also thinking of the time frames involved. So you chose the time period of the final estimate of the costs as the reference point, I guess. I know it's all kind of semantics, but thinking of just the timelines of so when you're doing the cost benefit analysis, are you thinking of it from a planning perspective in the sense that so your frame of reference would be t equal to 0, where you may be deciding on which project to choose. And so you'd kind of choose the project, then the construction of it, or that would entail some uncertainty. So that's that, which is kind of just the adjustment of where your frame of reference was. But then also thinking of benefits, I see, since you haven't mentioned really the asset involved, and when it's, sort of big infrastructural projects, I think one of the challenges of any form of sort of, choice models, residential land use, those kind of things, predicting extremely long-term benefits are very hard. So when we think of Opera House now, from the time of construction, I think that level of uncertainty might just be, insurmountable. So that's, I guess, a comment, and I mean, also looking forward to what your thoughts are in terms of what is your scope and frame of reference to make the, the analysis for the PhD manageable.
Yeah, I'll respond. I'm not sure if there was a question in there, but I'll respond. Thank you for the comment. I mean, you're exactly right. It's the last part of your comment, the benefits. I mean, we saw that the costs are very hard to analyze and to collect the data. Benefits are exponentially more difficult, and in part because it's not collected, and in part because, yeah, you're talking about a highway that has a lifespan of, whatever, 60, 80 years before a major rehabilitation is necessary. How do you calculate the benefits at the time of decision making? I mean, I don't know. This is definitely something we will be looking into. And just to answer directly your question about the asset types, the data was anonymized for non-disclosure agreements, but mainly we're looking at network. So we're looking at rail and roads. That's kind of our bread and butter. That's what we're looking at. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's going to be a difficult journey, and maybe in the future I can return and answer your question in a better way.
Yeah, I hope you have some fun along the way.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? I had a question. Pablo.
Go ahead, Adrian. No,
Okay.
if there is
yeah,
time.
sure. Yeah, I mean, it was more of like a comment, and maybe just to like hear your thoughts. My general thought is that humans seem to be the problem. We systematically underestimate costs and project timelines, and overestimate benefits that come with the project. So it's something that was very exciting to me that you mentioned was like the potential of using like these tools that we've gotten and learned about through big data, like machine learning, statistical tools that we're now know more about. So I guess I'd just be interested in hearing what you had to say on that, if you had like more to say on, or what you're thinking about.
Yeah, it's another great point. To address the systematic bias, I think you called it, is some of my background is in reference class forecasting. I don't know if you've heard about that, but it's the theory of optimism bias, which is exactly what you said, the planning fallacy. Humans tend to underestimate the costs and overestimate the benefits. And Ben Fluveberg, I've worked with him a bit. He's kind of the titan in this regard. And so the other side being this machine learning big data aspect. And I'm kind of honestly torn between the two paths, because I think you're totally right. This bias is the human factor is a huge factor in these estimates, hands down. At the same time, maybe we can address some of these things with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Maybe not all of it. There is a lot of really cool things going on with big data, with machine learning. Like Plan comes to mind. In the UK, they're doing great things with schedule analysis, doing really interesting things with machine learning, artificial intelligence. I have not yet decided which kind of path I will be heading down, but I guess that's the privilege of being at the beginning of your PhD, that you kind of get to play with multiple options and think about what the best way might be.
Exciting. Pablo?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a comment and also a little bit of a question. And so it seems that in terms of the quality of the estimates, precision and accuracy, a couple of factors that might play a role is essentially when structures are landmarks, unique, like the Sydney Opera House versus ordinary. I mean, I'm not sure like kind of if in road construction, essentially the quality of these estimates is quite as poor, but I don't know. I think the data that you have actually seems quite interesting. And then the other thing is that who bears the risk is probably somewhat important. And so I mean, and this is tied to a lot of contracting schemes that have appeared, right? And so in particular, like sometimes the contracts are such that the government pays what is agreed upon in the contract, full stop, right?
Mhm.
And so in those cases, when the company bears the risk, my guess is that the quality of the estimates might be different than in cases where essentially the compensation depends on or is tied to, let's say, costs that are incurred and so on. I mean, and certainly in terms of cost overruns, I think that sometimes essentially changing the scope of the project for a variety of reasons, and this applies when projects are unique. I think that that's something that plays a role. And anyways, I don't know if you have any thoughts, and
Yeah,
sorry to take up so much time.
no, yeah, I'll try to keep in the time limit here. The landmark versus ordinary project. I mean, of course, the Sydney Opera House is yeah, it's not a road you build every couple of years. So it's kind of a far out example, but I think it's a fun example that shows, you know, what can happen. But of course, yeah, a road will have a different animal than something like a landmark. And your question about, you know, who bears the risk and the contracting, I mean, all these kind of soft factors that decide the project, the type of project, how the project progresses through the phases, is a huge factor, of course. But I think I like the idea that regardless of who bears the risk, everyone stands to benefit from this sort of data and this sort of research. Both the people making the bids, so the contractors, and the people who are putting out the contracts, the government in the case of a road. Everyone stands to gain from that better understanding of what are the risks, how do people handle risks. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. I think, yeah, there's so much to research, and again, I'll take the privilege of being in the very first phase of my PhD and being able to determine all these things. Thanks for the comment.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everybody for all these great discussion. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Jing. So Jing Yu is currently pursuing her PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering at Northwestern University. She holds a bachelor's degree in aviation engineering and a master's degree in civil engineering. Under the supervision of Professor Pablo Durango-Cohen, her research focuses on the life cycle assessment and environmental design of transportation systems. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jing.
Thank you, Ajahn. So let me share my screen. Can everybody see my slides? Yeah, cool. So it's been very excited to introduce my topic here, considering the environmental impact in pavement design, and we are using a input-output life cycle assessment to address the environmental impacts. And what we are doing is to develop a framework to support product design with the goal to minimize the total life cycle environmental impact. And this framework that we developed can not only support multiple sets of design alternatives, but also provide some directions for further improvement and investment by performing the sensitivity analysis. And although it is a general, we're trying to make it a general design tools can be applied to many kinds of design problems. We will use a pavement design as an example to illustrate our framework. So, and let's start with a very classic problem in pavement design area, the comparison between asphalt and concrete surface. So traditionally, it can be performed by, it can be done by performing life cycle assessment separately on those two kinds of materials. And the briefly simplified structure is shown as this picture. We can perform a life cycle assessment separately in these two trees. It is straightforward, but the problem is that with the increased number of design alternatives, we might have explosion numbers of the trees that we need to consider. So we develop our own frameworks that keeps the materials with similar functionality within one set, and I call it the set of alternatives. And the upper level demand will be satisfied as long as the demand of alternative sets are satisfied by any of the product inside. So as you can see here, there's a alternative set here. And this structure will allow us to have multiple sets of design alternatives in any levels of this tree. And what we need is just perform the life cycle assessment one time as a whole. So this is actually the example I will introduce later. As you can see, we have a lot of alternative materials here. And if we need to make a comparison one by one, there will be 36 trees instead of one big trees as a whole. So now let me review some backgrounds of the input-output analysis. I will take the structure of a concrete road as an example. So the number here represents the quantity to satisfy the upper levels demand. And we can capture this structure within the matrix called the bill of material matrix. The columns of this matrix represents the requirements of other materials to produce one unit of these kind of product. And we denote Y as the final demand and X as the gross requirements of each product, each materials. And we can capture the relationship between X and Y by adding up all the gross requirements at each level of the tree. And these equations also has a matrix form expressions, and we can use the bill of materials matrix to have this form, this kind of expressions. And if we expand those simple sectors to an economic sectors, this will basically follows the idea of input-output analysis to capturing the interrelationship of those economic sectors. And now it's natural to ask, how can we capture the substitution relationship in our product design structure? And is it still possible to have that matrix form expressions of X and Y's? So this is our structure with with the existence of alternatives. So we can write down all the quantitative relationship of materials. Noted that the dashed line box indicates the alternative set here. And the demand could be satisfied by any of the including materials. And as you can see here, the demand of pavement can be satisfied by either 3 units of asphalt or 2 units of concrete. And it doesn't have to be one of them to be chosen. In some cases, the demand of pavement can be satisfied by those 2 materials together. So we add them up to the demand of pavement. And this is the quantitative relationship. And can we still have that matrix form expressions under our structure? The answer is yes. And we just need to make some slightly adjustment of the identical matrix and the bill of material matrix here. So under these adjustment of the alternative sets, we will still have a nice matrix form expressions of the final demand and the growth requirements. So you may wonder why we are making so much efforts to keep everything in the matrix form. Because we are going to perform an input-output based life cycle assessment, which requires us to integrate all information of the product design structure with the input-output table, which is a matrix form. And this is along the line with the research done by Chris Hendrickson, where he also performed the input-output analysis, but separately in the asphalt pavement and the concrete pavement. As we know, the IO table is based on the economic activities, which means that the flow they capture is in the monetary value. Well, in our structure, the flow are captured by the physical values, which means that we need to connect the leaf nodes of our structure with the economic sectors by some unit price shown as Qs here. And we will have a matrix of the unit price to integrate those 2 kinds of matrix. And we will make a very big matrix called W, which will still gives us the relationship of the final demand and growth requirements. And the gross economic activities will help us to find the environmental impact by multiplying a matrix of emission factor. And this is why we are trying to get growth requirements by solving that linear system. The rows of the EKJ represents some certain kinds of emission rates. And we will use CO2 emissions to represent the environmental impact in our following examples. So here we will have our formulations of the problem. We will have we will have our goal to minimize the total environmental impact, the total CO2 emissions, and noted that there's some redundancy in our linear systems, which means that if we solve this problem, there will be some materials, there will be some variables in the optimal basis, while some are not. The positive numbers of the X will indicate that these materials will be the best choice to make the total CO2 emissions minimum. So that's why, that's how we make the design. So let me introduce the examples that we have here. We basically have two different kinds of pavement structure. One is with the asphalt surface, another is with the concrete surface, and we have several alternative materials for each layers of the road. And we also make some assumptions about the thickness of the road, and also some maintenance phase assumptions of the road, because if we need to make a fair comparison between the asphalt and concrete, we need to, they have different durations, they have different life services. We also made some assumptions of that. And here is the formulation of our problem. This is quite simple. And our goal is to minimize the total CO2 emissions with the constraints of an input-output constraints and the non-negativity constraints. And by solving this problem, we will get some certain numbers of the growth requirements, and I will show you the results. So as you can see here, we got several positive numbers for the growth requirements of these materials, which indicates that the concrete and the crushed concretes are the optimal choice under certain criteria if we want to minimize the total CO2 emissions. So, and also we have some, we have the reduced cost, indicates that how many CO2 emissions should be reduced for these other materials to be considered as comparable to the optimal ones. And we also report the dual variables, which indicates that if the demand of surface materials increase by 1 unit, how many more CO2 emissions will there be? And these are just simple results can gathered from every optimal servers and optimal. And there's something more interesting that I want to introduce. So one of the reasons that we try to make our design problem in linear form is that there could be more insights provided by the closed form sensitivity analysis results of the linear problem. For example, if we already solve these optimization problem, like we solved them before, and we can tell how the optimal result will change when some changes occurred in the objective function by checking the new reduced cost associated with the new objective function. So if there's something changes to this E, we will have a new reduced cost of RC, and by checking if the RC is greater than 0, we will know, and in the new criteria, will our optimal choice remains the same, or we have some better choice to make. And this is an example of the sensitivity analysis results. Considering a case when we are, when someone says, oh, we are not minimizing the total CO2 emissions anymore. I'm more interested in minimizing the electricity use or water usage instead of CO2 emissions. And we don't actually need to solve the whole problems again. The only thing that we need to do is to calculate the new reduced cost and see if it is greater than 0 or less than 0. And as you can see, in some criteria, for example, like minimizing the electricity usage, all the new reduced costs are greater than 0, which means that the optimal choice still remains the same. While for some criteria that the reduced cost is less than 0, this indicates that some of the materials will be the better choice than the other one. So this is the first case of this of the sensitivity analysis, and we also have some other cases, other interesting findings about the sensitivity analysis. So imagine that if there are some new technologies can reduce the CO2 emissions of certain activities. And which kind of activities will be benefits to our choice? So we decrease like 50% of CO2 emissions of one of the IO sector to simulate that the emissions of that certain activities could be decreased when some technology developed, while others remains the same. And we perform this kind of analysis for 491 times, which is the total number of the economic sectors in the IO table, and reported several interesting findings in the table here. So as you can see, for most of the sectors, the reduced cost of the unchosen materials, in this case, the asphalt, remains the same, which means that the reduced in CO2 emissions of that kinds of activities will not affect our preference over asphalt or concrete. But if we reduce the emissions of some certain activities, you can see that the gap between the asphalt and concrete is actually decreased. And for this case, it's actually less than 0, which means that asphalt will be the new optimal choice. And for these kind of economic activities, the technologies that reduce the emissions will be more beneficial to the choice of the asphalt. And on the contrary, for these kind of activities, the technologies that reduce the CO2 emissions will actually be more beneficial to the choice of concrete. This kind of information provides us some insights for further developments, the technologies or investments, if we want to make some choices over the asphalt or concrete. And I think this is interesting because and based on the input-output analysis, we have a very broad system boundary, and we can consider all kinds of economic activities here. So we can actually find that indirect relationships between those activities. So And to make a conclusion of our framework, there are some of the strengths which this framework can capture the multiple sets of design parameters, and it can be efficiently solved by a linear programming system. And it returns the closed form sensitivity analysis results, which could provide us many insights for further improvements. And that's all of my presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer the questions.
Insightful work, and I guess, you know, all of the results that you have are, I think, very exciting. So are there any questions that we have for Jing? Yeah, Aditya, please.
Thanks, Jing, for the presentation. That was very interesting. And one question that I had, just in terms of clarification, in terms of the gamut of, I mean, the possibilities of solutions that the linear program might generate. So in this kind of a structure, the way when you showed the tree, I mean, I guess the setup is such that you expect the design to either be, you know, asphalt or concrete, right? So you don't want a situation where it gives you a mix of this and that, and which kind of has a binary aspect to it in either one or the other. I was wondering if you can comment on how the structure of the linear program in this case ensures that that the optimal solution never gives a mix of both designs. I mean, yeah, so because I'm thinking of like total unimodularity or those kind of situations, whether that happens in this case or not. If you could comment on that, that would be useful.
Oh, thanks. So actually, I think the mix of the asphalt and concrete is allowed in this framework. And usually the optimal result will give us just one of them, unless we have some very tight, because as you can see here, the only constraints that I have here is to satisfy the demand. And this will usually gives us just only one choice of the two alternatives. And the situation that you said, the mixture of the two materials could be happened if I add some more, if I add more constraints. For example, if I add a if I add a constraint about the money, about the budget, and if I tighten that budget constraint, it might lead to some cases when one of the choice cannot meet the budget constraint, and we need to add more and add another kind of materials to make the whole budget cheaper. And I think this kind of situation is allowed in our framework. So
I see. Okay. Thank you.
I guess as a follow-up on that, would restricting the linear program basically to a binary integer program pose like challenges? I mean, this might be a question that you haven't considered yet, but is this something that poses challenges for some reason, or is it a potential like area that you could expand into?
So the reason that I didn't add the binary constraints to these materials is that I want to have a closed form sensitivity analysis results. that could provide us many insights. And I think because it is harder for have a closed form result to the binary problems. So I think because it is not that unreasonable to have a mixture of the two kinds of materials. So I think in order to keep that sensitivity analysis results, I will choose this one.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? I think we have time for one more. Okay. In that case, I think if we have no more questions, I want to thank David and Jing for their excellent presentations, and for all of you for joining and participating and making this, I think, a really great discussion and opportunity to learn from our colleagues. And so I guess I'll ask you to stay tuned for the upcoming meeting on September 30th. So that'll be the next session. And I'll be, so we'll be sharing these recordings on the website as well, for any reference, in case for those who missed it because of time zones or just conflicts. So thank you again all, and I hope to see you again in the next meeting.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the initiative to schedule this.
Yeah, thank you, Pablo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.